I'm just going to talk from here. This is my best little leaning post right here. So I noticed today, normally we have an aisle when we come down at the beginning of service. And with COVID and 6-foot distancing, you have to really wind your way through. We need to give it more time to make it to the dais. Anyway, practicing the presence, living in that presence, hopefully the whole time. I wanted to start with a little experience that we had back in 2007, which was, 13 years ago. So about 14 years ago or so, Hriman and I discovered the movie Padre Pio, Miracle Man. And it's an amazingly well done, really the best I've seen, biography of Padre Pio. For those who don't know, he was a Catholic priest, a mystic. He experienced the wounds of the stigmata. And he lived, he left his body in 1968. So he's fairly contemporary, at least with some of us in this room. Anyway, we loved that movie, and we found ourselves in 2007 visiting Swami Kriyananda, Ananda's founder and Yogananda's direct disciple. We were visiting him in India, and the very next morning he had to go for some medical tests and invited us to go along with him. And in those tests, it was discovered that he had colon cancer. So they booked him for surgery the very next day after that. And so the night before going to the hospital, we're with him, and we took our head in our hand, which was what it was like when you recommended a movie to Swami Kriyananda. He either loved it or he, sort of quietly left the room after a few minutes. But anyway, we recommended this DVD, and he had a choice of watching it in the original Italian that it was filmed in with English subtitles, or else in English, which that night he was very tired and he didn't know if he had the energy to keep reading. So he decided for the English, which was dubbed over the Italian. We were about 10 minutes into it, even just a few minutes into it, you could see it had absolutely none of the vibration and power that it does when it was in the original Italian. So we begged him if we could start over and watch it in the Italian with the subtitles. And he said, okay, he was sort of going along with it. And sure enough, the power and beauty of Padre Pio's incredible vibration came through. And Swami Kriyananda was riveted. He loved the movie. But the interesting part to us, and let me sort of step aside for a minute, Swamiji, as we used to call him, when he was a little boy growing up, they didn't have Novocaine when you went to the dentist, so he never took Novocaine. And then when he was a young adult and thereafter, he was a yogi, and he decided he wanted to test mind over matter. And so he never took Novocaine his whole life in all of his dental work. And in fact, he had in the nose. Some of you know a deviated septum, what that is. He had to have a surgery to correct that, and he didn't take Novocaine for that either. And the doctors were just sweating bullets, doing that with him. So here we were watching this movie, and then we remembered that there's a scene in the movie where Padre Pio has to have a surgery. And he decides that because he made a commitment to the church demanded of him that he never show his stigmata wounds to anyone. He always wore gloves. So he decided that he was not going to take the anesthetic for his surgery. I forget, I think it was either appendix or gallbladder or something like that. And the doctor was, "You can't do this," he was going crazy with it. Pio said, "No, I know you. You're gonna take my gloves off and look at my wounds. I can't do it." So he went through the surgery without the anesthetic, and we were worried about that scene coming on and Swamiji getting ideas about not taking the anesthetic for this big cancer surgery the next day. And the beauty of it was, and here's the punchline, for some reason that scene never came on. It got skipped. I don't know how. I don't know how it could be possible, but that scene never came on. And we all talked about it after Swami left the room. We were so relieved that they didn't plant that idea in his mind and that we'd have to deal with that issue. So I don't know if it's him living in the presence or us living in the presence, but the presence was with us in this particular situation. When you're blessed to have had loving parents, and I realize not everyone has had that blessing, but when you are, then you learn about loving from that parent. And I know in my case, when Hriman and I got married, he had a daughter from a prior marriage, Molly, and she was an adolescent when we got married. So, a challenging time in her life. But I remember consciously learning to love her through the eyes of Hriman. And similarly, I learned to love Christ through the eyes of Yogananda. In my case, that was a big leap because I was hailed from a non-religious Jewish family we were Dutch Jews. We had lost most of our relatives in the war, in the concentration camps. And so I was raised being skeptical of Christ and told not to trust Christians. You never would know when they would turn on you. So making that leap to embracing Christ on my altar, not just on my altar, but in my heart, was a big step. But I was able to make that leap actually quite easily through watching how Yogananda loved Christ and learning with my heart and my mind about his teachings, his explanation of the similarity of the teachings of Christ and Krishna, which is what he came here in part to share, and explaining them metaphysically, Christ's teachings, in such a way that I could not only embrace them, but love them. Yogananda came for a few reasons, and another one of those reasons was so that we could have our own direct inner experience of God, of the living presence of God that resides within us. And at Christmas time, he started the tradition of the Christmas meditation, the Christmas retreat, a day dedicated to inwardly trying to tune in to that Christ presence, that infinite Christ, that cosmic consciousness of Christ that resides within each and every one of us. And it's interesting because I remember a long time ago taking my annual seclusion for a week, as we've always done. And in seclusion, for those who don't know, you try to be away from others. You are away from others. You're alone. You're in silence. You eat little. You meditate a lot. So you're just concentrating as much as you can on God. And you read a little, chant a little, reading, inspirational writing. And so I remember one year reading Yogananda's teachings, his more esoteric writings on meditation. And I was so engrossed in it at a certain point, I just had to stop. And I had to put the book aside and say, I got to stop reading about this. I have to start doing it. I have to start experiencing it. Inspiration comes when we read, but I found that the more I recognized that I needed to actually do it, the longer I was able to meditate, the deeper I was able to meditate, and the less I would find myself reading in seclusion. So the living presence comes in the living. It comes in the doing. And how do we experience that presence the most? Well, that's where the affirmation today about being practical in our spirituality comes into being, because the more we're able to become transparent of ego, the more ego can be sort of not just pushed aside, but transcended. The more transparent we become, the more we live in that presence. I remember on one occasion years ago, there was a person living at the community where we were living at the time at Ananda village. And she was one of the more difficult people I've ever met in my life, probably the most difficult person I'd ever met in my life. And at the time, I was on the membership committee, and a few of us had the opportunity one day, we were talking with Swamiji and mentioned that there was the thought maybe not to take her in as a member because she just caused chaos wherever she went with her difficult personality. And Swamiji just smiled and he said, if we didn't have her, we'd have to go out and find her. You know, you don't get that beautiful pearl in the oyster without some friction. We don't transcend our egos without tests. God tests our love. We test our love. It's constantly tested in every moment of the day for most of us in our interactions. Swami Kriyananda tells when he first read Autobiography of a Yogi and drove out to California from New York to meet Yogananda, he went to the wrong ashram. Yogananda had several locations, and where he went, this woman opened the door and asked him a bunch of questions that were, well, they were off-putting to him, because essentially the bottom line was it was going to take at least 4 years of living nearby before he could ever become a resident. But she told him where Yogananda was that day, and so he took another bus and he went to meet Yogananda. And on that ride, he thought about this woman, and it was Sister Gyanamata, who was Yogananda's foremost woman disciple. And he thought about their conversation, and he remembered how annoyed he was with this old biddy. And then he reflected on her eyes and her demeanor, and he realized that she was a very high soul. She had wisdom in her eyes, and she had an incredibly calm vibration. And in that moment, he asked for forgiveness when he saw his own folly. Inwardly, he asked for forgiveness, and he said in that moment, he knew he would be accepted. And so when we judge, when we allow our own likes and dislikes and predilections to get in the way, it, sort of covers up our transparency. I was remembering that Yogananda said that Abraham Lincoln had been a Himalayan yogi in a prior life. And I thought, talk about tested. He had to prosecute a war, he had lost a child, he had a very difficult marriage, he was assassinated. You name it, the tests came to him. And yet, whether we're in front of a test, in the middle of a test, or after a test, if we call on God, if we try to do it with God, if we embrace it and go through it rather than pushing it away, it's that very test that will uplift us, because we'll be a little more free of ego on the other side of it. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda experienced cosmic consciousness through his guru, Sri Yukteswar. And in that telling, he shares that not long afterwards he asked Sri Yukteswar, when will I know God? And that he didn't write anything for himself or just to tell a tale. It was always for us to see. That particular interchange gave me so much hope, because it's as if when we're in our human condition, we have a veil over our eyes, over our consciousness. And we don't realize how much we actually are living in the presence of God. This is something that Swami Kriyananda was constantly offering to us, saying to us, insisting that we listen to and hear and experience. Living in that presence is the reality, I'm going to say, of not just everyone in this room and everyone watching today online, but everyone who thinks of God and seeks God. Joy to you.
Listen to these words.